You're listening to Design Systems Beyond the Button, where we dive into everything related to design systems for everyone from newbies to seasoned practitioners. I'm Neff, Products Marketing Manager at zeroheight, and I'm excited to use this podcast to get my burning design systems questions answered. I'm joined by my colleague, Michelle Chen, a design advocate who has seen and experienced so much around design systems.
And I'm looking forward to sharing the tips, tricks, and experiences based on what I've done, but also from what I've seen from other design system teams. There's not much publicly being said because I think design systems can be personal to a company. So, this might be a great way to shed some light on what's going on so you can create your bestest design system ever.
All right. Today's topic is where does user research fit into design systems, which is an apt topic because as folks who work on product teams, we know that user research is incredibly important for the products that we create. But it's also a thing when it comes to the design systems that we're working on as well. And what's interesting about it is that there are sort of two aspects of user research when we think about design systems. There's user research on the product, like how do our customers actually interact with the products that we create, and the patterns and components and all that good stuff. And then there are the users of the design system, like our colleagues. How do they interact with the design system? Are they finding the information that they need and all of that? So let's start with the folks who are actually using the design system and how we might be able to conduct some user research there. But before we get too far into it, Michelle, can you just give us a refresher when we think about the main consumers of a design system? Who do you think we should be thinking about?
Yeah, so I guess most obviously the designers who are using the components to design with,
Mm,
as well as the developers who are using the code libraries to create the product features with. So those are the main two users. There are some others that might include accessibility uh, analysts or people as well as content people, content designers
mm.
who might also be consuming the design system.
Yeah, for sure. So I suppose when we think about user research and we say, okay, I'm building a design system, when is the ideal time to start reaching out to consumers of the design system?
I think early on is really, really helpful. I think I'm always going to say, as soon as possible for everything. I think part of that helps with getting sharing awareness because, like I said in previous episodes, no one likes surprises. So
Yeah.
nobody wants to know that, one day that they need to start using this design system that they had no idea about. So just getting them warmed up to the idea about the design system, that it's coming, that their input is valuable because I think the other thing is like a lot of people think about the design system and think about all the bits and pieces that go into it that we need to in order to make the product, but they don't think about so much about the user experience of the actual people consuming the design system. So, as a designer, is it easy for me to find components to add to my design? Or as an engineer, do I know where to go to find the components in the code library? Is it easy for me to add these components to the code from the code library, or is it really hampering my workflow? Um,
Yeah, when I think about user research in general, I feel like it only works if there is this contract between the person that's conducting user research and the person that's sharing feedback, right? Like, as the person that's conducting user research, I have to believe that you are giving me your genuine ideas and that you aren't holding back, whether your feedback is positive or negative. And on the other side of things, you have to believe that I want to incorporate your feedback in some way, right? Like I'm not just like listening to you for it to go in one ear and out the other. And the reason that I bring this up is I think that there is so much around design systems that is about people change. And I suppose when you ask for user research might break that contract. So for example, imagine you've like built out like your entire component library in Figma, you have like a React library, you've got your documentation site, and then you're like, "Hey, I want to hear what you think." That person is like, "Well, do you really? Because you already got so far along that you're not really in a space to be able to incorporate the feedback that I'm giving you." And I think the earlier that we ask for research and the earlier we ask for opinions based off of what you're saying, the more we sort of portray this idea that we want to understand like what's bugging you right now, like how can a design system actually help your workflows, and we do it at a time where we can legitimately incorporate that feedback and get people to be hyped about the design system, get them to feel like it's something that they want to use versus it being something that's begrudging.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think that's the thing is like building that trust and opening those lines of communication early on is just more meaningful. It helps with adoption as well. So,
Mhm.
by the time the first version rolls out, people know about the design system. They know that you've taken their feedback into consideration. They know that they can use it, they can trust it. And I think it goes a long way. And you don't have to share and get feedback on everything, but I think at certain
Mhm.
moments you can definitely ask and say, "Hey, do you mind checking out this workflow, testing it out?" And it's really helpful and easy at that stage because everyone knows it's fluid, especially because the designers and engineer know about the iterative process, the idea of being flexible, the idea of giving feedback. I think that really makes it easier to get that buy-in, to get that feedback that is actually gonna help. And, you know, I think once people see that you are asking for feedback, it's more likely that they're gonna trust and want to make sure that this design system is successful because they are gonna be the primary users of it.
At the early stage, what are maybe like 2 or 3 questions that you found to be helpful to ask during user research?
Yeah, I think, part of it's just like, what I think I love there's a book called Game Storming by Dave Gray and Sunny Brown and Dave Macanufo maybe, that I really like that it has a lot of good games for, just different activities, brainstorming, user research. So they have this exercise called Pains and Gains, and it's a very simple one where you can ask, participants, "Hey, what are your pains and gains?" So, like, what does success look like for you?
Hmm.
Also, but what stands in your way? What keeps you up at night? Like, what are those pains? And people can tell you, like, when I have to code stuff, it's like 50 steps. I can't find what I'm looking for. I have to ask all these questions. Simple stuff like that is really helpful in understanding, okay, how can the design system help alleviate some of those pain points? How can the design system support what makes a developer or designer successful? So I think that's like the starter question, and I think that can really pave the way for your next steps when creating that design system.
For sure. And I suppose if we think about this sequentially, right? Like maybe you're asking about pains and gains before the design system is fully developed. But then after you launch that version 1, hopefully you've had a party to celebrate all of the hard work that the team has put in. And it's out there, right? And now you're like, okay, cool. Like I want people to adopt it. What types of questions are you then asking in terms of user research? And how does that sort of differ from that initial pains and gains broad conversation?
Yeah, so I definitely think, the beginning part is more generative, you're exploring and getting a good sense more broadly, but as, people are using the system, it can kind of turn more into like usability testing of,
Mm.
how is this working? How is the design system working for you with your workflow? What's challenging? Can you show me what you do just so I have a better sense? Because I think that's the other thing is as you're designing this process, especially if it's more of a design-led initiative, you might not know how engineers go about, finding, like, code to put in, how they go about coding. I think a lot of times when I've talked to, engineers, they're like, "Oh, yeah, like, this is how we find stuff. We just type in a couple characters, so if we name things in a way that could lead to mistakes, it's not going to be helpful. So we need to name things in a way that can reduce mistakes, which I never would have thought of. But yeah, stuff like that, like those little insights are really helpful in terms of improving the product for your users.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I suppose some of those gnarly insights around how folks are searching for things and that might not be something that comes up in your early research, but folks need an artifact to actually be searching through to be able to be like, oh, yeah, I forgot. This thing certainly needs to be in place in order for this to be usable for us. I suppose thus far, we've sort of been talking about like person to person user research. Like I pull you aside and I'm like, hey, I have a couple of questions for you. But are there other forms of user research that design system teams can utilize to understand how they can improve the design system?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think there's definitely a couple. So you can do a survey,
Mm,
like more broadly, like a quarterly survey. So especially if there are existing team or organizational surveys, if you can piggyback onto those and add like a question or two about the design system, you might get some good insight. So you can even ask like, how like more quantitative or qualitative or yeah, more quantitative questions. How, would you rate this design system out of like, I don't know, 5 stars or something like that? Also get some feedback out like what are, some pain points. So that's also like one way to get information. You can see, component usage if it's going up, product coverage, so like more of those like metric, like measuring types of mechanisms. I think if there's unknowns and questions and you're not really sure, what to ask or how to ask it, if you can reach out to a user researcher in your
mm,
organization just to say, "Hey, I'm trying to figure out, how well this is working, but I'm not really sure what questions to ask." That's perfectly fine because that's what their expertise is in. So just because you are on the design system doesn't mean that you are an expert user researcher. So definitely defer to them for guidance. Because I think that's the other thing is like it might take you a while to kind of figure out those right questions, but they're really good at that because that's their role and they can help you very quickly. And they might have some other ideas in terms of like things that you could measure or ask or other methods, which I think is always super helpful. And they also probably have access to tools like Qualtrics or something. So yeah, definitely lean on your other team members.
for sure. And I think that's an important thing to remember. I feel like design system work as a whole can be so cross functional and you touch so many teams. And at the same time, I think we both have spoken to so many design system teams that feel like they're operating on an island. And maybe they have to find the answers to every single hard question themselves. So it's important sometimes to be like, hey, I need to conduct user research. I think it's important, but I'm an expert on design systems and maybe not an expert on user research. And we have those folks here who probably would be over the moon to talk to you about these things, share their tools, share their mindset, and be like, oh my God, I'm so glad you came.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's like that's the fun part. You get to nerd out a little bit about each
Hmm.
other's like fields and disciplines. And that's always fun. People will always make time for that. People might not. And I think with all just user researchers in general, I've never met one that was sitting idle. They're always so busy, so they might not have time to like help execute things or do the
Hmm.
heavy lifting, but they can at least support you. Because I think, for them, user research is so vital to their core that they're going to want to support that. Um, but they might not physically have the time to do a lot of the actual executing, but they're always happy to chat, even if it's a 15-20 minute conversation. But yeah, I
Yeah,
think
for
that's like
sure.
an important takeaway. Like design system people should not be on their own siloed island. It's very easy to get isolated because you're making all these decisions and you're thinking about everybody else. But yeah, definitely feel free to reach out. Like, I think no one's gonna fault you for asking questions. Like, even if you ask an engineering manager, "Hey, what kind of surveys do you run for your team to get,
Hmm.
an understanding?" And I'm sure they'd be more than happy to talk about it. Um, yeah, I think it just can't hurt. You have nothing to lose, right?
Certainly. And I think that there is also something that I'm pulling out of what you're saying. And I think this has been a thread throughout all of our episodes in terms of relying on existing processes, right? Like, we all love a good survey and they certainly have their place. But I suppose instead of being like, hey, we have this survey to add to your dozens, if there's one that's already in place, like, let's throw questions about the design system in there. I think the other thing that we have as design system practitioners, especially if you have a documentation site, is you can embed lots of surveys and feedback forms and all of that sort of stuff inside the documentation to sort of like get that feedback as people are going through it. So even if you go to user researcher and they're like, hey, like, I think you should do XYZ, but I can't help you with the execution. It's almost like we can say no problem because we have this perfectly great place where we can execute on user research because we already have the documentation site sort of ready to go.
Yeah. So, not to name drop, but zeroheight has some survey tools. So you can embed a survey like a Google form or type form, but also like at the bottom of the page, there's a thing where you can say, "Is this page helpful?"
Hmm.
And a quick thumbs up, thumbs down, which I think is a very low level lift for you to implement, but also for people to participate in. And that can definitely add some feedback in some way for you to then start exploring a little bit deeper.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I think some of the things like that quick like thumbs up, thumbs down also get to lead to rich conversations amongst like you as a design system team. Like, of course, like you want to understand like why somebody thumbs something up or why they thumbs it down, but you can also say like, wow, we've got this page that's for our button component that 99% of people are thumbs upping, and we've got this other page that's for our drop down item component that everybody is giving the thumbs down. What is it that's different about these two pages, right? Like, is it one that has like these super clear rules and people are like, this is great because I can look through it and I can immediately tell how I should and shouldn't use this component? And there's this other one that's like a little bit vague, and you can sort of like have conversations about that. And based off of conclusions that you have, and perhaps even bolstering that with like some interviews of people who are using the design system, you could even start to like establish patterns for your design system and say like, hey, like when we put out a component documentation page, it needs to have XYZ because based off of our usability testing, those are the things that get people really excited about using it.
Yeah, for sure. I think part of this also, the research doesn't have to be formalized, right? So you can,
Mm,
like Neff is saying, is like take some of this preliminary data of like one page is doing better than the other and just like start having conversations. Hey, I noticed that this drop down page seems to be struggling a little bit. What's your take on it? Like you might ask a designer, you might ask a developer. And you might find something, really, really insightful to be able to make some small tweaks. I think that's the thing is like your design system is going to be something that lasts for a really long time. So there's a lot of opportunity to make these small adjustments and fine tune things so they are better. It doesn't have to be like a huge formalized research like operation, which we technically, a lot of times have to do when it comes
mhm.
to um, usability testing or user research with customers. It's a lot more formal. This can definitely be more informal, and that's completely fine.
Totally. Let's talk about customers for a hot second.
Yeah.
So, I think the headline, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that design systems teams are not responsible for conducting customer level user research. Would you agree with that in general?
Yeah, if it's a centralized team, you're not really that close to the customers. Um, and yeah, yes, agreed.
I, I feel like it physically pains you to give me a yes versus in it depends. Like I could see it in like your entire being. But thank you.
I try to keep it succinct. I was like not trying to ramble, but yeah, let's go with yes.
All right, cool. Uh, so you're not conducting the user research, but I suppose you want to incorporate it in some way into the design system that you create. How do you sort of like implement customer level user research into design systems?
Yeah, this is a question that I get often because I think, as we all know, user research is important. But then it's just like, it feels kind of weird to be like, hey, user, click this button and let me know what you think. Can you click this button successfully? Right. So, um, the idea is not to test components in isolation because that's not a realistic usage of it, and it's just kind of weird,
Sure.
right? Because of course people are just gonna click a button, they have no other choice. So, what really works is, and this also goes to the point that, like, user researchers are typically, very short-staffed, and have a lot going on, so they can't spend time testing individual components, but what really works well is if you work with a design team that is working on a feature, and you have some components that you want them to test, you can put it into one of their usability testing flows. So maybe it's you want to test all these form elements. So the input, the drop down, the button, the primary, secondary buttons, like what have you, radio buttons, all that type of stuff. You can test in a usability test when you're like testing a workflow. So have the user, please complete this order form and
Hmm.
see how they do with the components, see, do they understand what's going on? And that way the components are, represented in what's like a realistic use case versus like, you know, test this radio button to see if it works. And that way you can get some feedback. And I think the reason why you want to get some user research, if possible, is just to confirm and validate that the component does work as needed. Um, and so that way you can knock out like several components and it doesn't have to be like a standalone
Hmm.
usability test like project. It can be part of someone's flow. If like a one of your apps is testing a new feature, they can work this in, get some feedback. Um, and I think that's super helpful. It might not be necessary for everything. If it exists in the product and it's done well, you can consider that like a tried and true component because it has been maybe not formally usability tested, but like out in the wild long enough that it does work. But maybe you want to test like a complicated component or a different type of pattern, um, where getting some more of that more detailed feedback is super helpful. And you can see, I would again, this is kind of where it comes to reaching out to your community in your organization to see like what people are working on. Um, so say they might be working on a new feature and you're working on a calendar, a date picker. You can see if the date picker fits into their feature to see if that's something that they could test. But I also think like you can test date pickers in isolation because it's a complicated component. You might be able to say, hey, pick you're planning a vacation, pick a start and end date or something like that. So yeah, I think there's definitely ways to work it in without having to um, make things weird.
That is always the goal. Don't make things weird. France had a question over in the chat where they said the designers and devs are the customers, right? And I think the answer to that is unequivocally yes. Like when we think about ourselves as design system practitioners or like members of design system team, our customers are our own colleagues. I think it starts to get a little bit wild because there's this almost like weird transitive property that's going on, right? Where we're like, yeah, the people that we really care about are our own colleagues, but what we're trying to enable them to do is to serve the customers a bit better, to build a better product. So I suppose when we think about user research in the context of customers, what we're trying to understand is, are those components that we shared with our colleagues actually helping them help customers better, right? And perhaps it gets a little bit convoluted, but it's kind of this like interesting thing in terms of like design systems, right? That you're like one step away from customers, but ideally the work that you're doing should help customers do their work.
Yeah, it's like a weird, like, inception meta, like, design for the design for the users, or something like
Mhm.
that. 'Cause I think that's the thing is, like, you're designing say you're designing buttons and you have different states of buttons, like a disabled, a loading, enabled, active hover, all those things, like, and you want to design that for like, the end user of the product, but you also wanna make sure that you are providing the right options for your design team that is designing. So you want them to be successful. So in some ways that, they need all those states as well to be able to do their job. Um, yeah, it gets weird, but we talked about not getting weird.
True, very true. I think the other thing that comes to mind, and I'm not even really sure that I love this as a description of design systems, but people like to throw around this idea of like, especially design system documentation, as like a source of truth. And I suppose if we use that for a hot second and we think about it in terms of what information we're providing devs and designers about how to build the product, then it's interesting to think about user research because we can say, like, hey, here's the code that you ought to use. Here is the asset from Figma or my design tool. But also, I want to share truths that we've learned from user research about why we want to implement things the way that we should. So I do think that there is sort of an incentive for us to bring in some of those best practices and findings that user researchers have found and make them accessible for folks so that it almost is like the Bible that you get to see as you're building the product, along with all of the tools that you need to be able to do it well.
Yeah, I think, showing transparency is really important because
Mm,
people need it's just not that they don't trust you, but they just like to see
they
information.
don't.
Um, but yeah, I think it's like that's the thing is like if I was a user of a design system and I'm like, well, how do I know that these check boxes were the ones that
Mm,
did well? Like, how do I like do I even know that they were tested? Right. So having and I see a lot of people in their documentation add like user research like results like this was tested as part of this project here's the results so you have a little bit more insight and I don't know how many people like look into digging into the findings of that, but I think just knowing that it was tested is like good enough to kind of help build that trust that you really need. Um and I think, it's helpful context to also see like when something is like a component is experimental. So before we would mark it at like my previous company, we would mark the component as a provisional component because it wasn't completely usability tested, but like we might have modified it from a previous thing that was, and that it would be going through testing soon, but it seemed good enough to be used. So
mhm.
we would like keep that status as provisional, like you can use it, but just to understand that it could change to something different later on, or it could be like confirm that this is the way we want to go based on usability testing, and then we'll put that the user research like at the bottom. And I think like that type of transparency is like really helpful for people consuming the design system. They can make a choice of like, okay, I can use this component knowing that it might change, or maybe I don't want to use it just yet and I want to use something else. But yeah, I think that level of transparency is super helpful.
That is such a good shout in terms of trying to make sure that people understand where we're getting our information and inspiring confidence in the folks who are using the design system, right? Like, I think we hope that our colleagues are going to take a look at these user research insights and they're going to be blown away and understand exactly how people use our products. But I would also argue that even if people don't look at it, but just see that there is a tab that exists that includes user research, is a win for the design system, right? Like, I think in the back of your mind, as a dev who maybe was unfamiliar with the design system, and you pop in there and you're like, wow, this is like a comprehensive site with lots of information, including user research, you might not say this consciously, but subconsciously you're like, oh man, like this is the thing I ought to use because they've done all of this legwork for me. They've answered the questions that I would have about how something might be implemented, and that is invaluable for design system teams that often are struggling for adoption.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, especially for smaller teams where it might be like 1 or 2 people working on the design system and making decisions, um, it can get really people can make it really personal. So it's like,
Mm,
"Oh, Neff and Michelle have decided that the buttons are gonna look like this, and that they're gonna function like this, and that they've decided that this is the right way." And people can get really kind of grumpy about it, especially if they, because I think depending on different companies, some people really want to work on the design system, and then they're told that they can't. So they get grumpy, and they kind of are like, "Why did Neff and Michelle get picked to do the design system?" So it gets a little political and weird. And I think when you have user research posted, you can say like, look, there is some data that backs some of these decisions from an objective point of view, like a third party usability test. So it's not just, it makes it less personal. It makes it a lot more factual. So then it doesn't become so much of like, oh, Michelle and Neff wanted to create the product to look like this. So that can also help support the efforts, but also have people, get excited that okay, this is validated by users, and then in turn adopt it versus be grumpy about the fact that they didn't get to be on the design system team.
100%. I think we've also had a conversation on this podcast about what you do if people are contributing things that aren't good to the design system, right? Like, this is a constant battle in terms of figuring out what contribution model is going to work inside of your company, encouraging contribution to the design system, and then also facing somewhat of an inevitability that somebody might contribute something that you don't want to actually add. And I think in those instances, user research can also be dope because it gives you a leg to stand on in terms of why you're not going to put it into the design system, right? Like you can say like, hey, it's not me who doesn't want to implement your component. It's just that we did this usability testing and it didn't perform well. Nothing against you, it's all about the testing, right? And then I think it also keeps us honest, right? Like we could, as a design system team, develop this component that we think is the absolute bee's knees, is going to be amazing, and we put it out to usability testing, and it's just not what we thought it was going to be. So lots of ways in which we want to sort of like use that usability testing and user research in order to validate what should and should not be in the design system and make sure that people feel confident in it.
Yeah, I've definitely I was speaking to this one team who um they were kind of getting bullied into putting stuff into the
No.
design system. Yeah, it was kind of they were just like people are creating these like components for their flows and they're just like we want this in there, but like the design system team, they were like this is really designed poorly, but like how do you say that without the person taking it very personally, So, we talked about usability testing to say like okay, um sure, let's try this out and usability test it and see what happens, and get feedback on that. Because that's a way to make it not so personal about like, oh, the
Mhm.
design system team is mean and they don't let other people contribute components, but there is a process. I think that's also helpful in kind of documenting what that process is. Just so people know that, what expectations are. I think a lot of times people are willing to follow the process as long as they know what it is and that it involves usability testing. So that does take the sting out of um, the rejection, I guess.
Yeah, I feel like some people might be listening and saying like, "Yeah, that's a great idea," but you also told me that user researchers are pretty scrapped and they're not going to spend time testing this component that is not great to start out with. And I also wonder if that gives us the opportunity to user research certain principles, and then create sort of like a list or things that might exist and say like, hey, like in order for a component to be good enough, it needs to be A, B, C, and D. And these are the rules that we've all agreed on. We know that these are good. And then if somebody comes with quote unquote bad component, even if we aren't able to usability test that particular component, we can say, hey, Bobby, like it meets A and it meets B, but it doesn't meet C and D. And as a team, we've already agreed on that. So, like, sorry, not sorry, but we can't throw it into the design system. But like, there might be ways in which we can still rely on user research, even if we can't conduct research on every single component, every single pattern.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a really good shout to consider, like what are your guiding principles for the components and patterns that live in your design system and establishing that, so maybe it's something like simplicity. And if this component is super complex, like unpacking, hey, this feels really complex, like what can we do to strive for principle number 2, which is
Hmm.
simplicity. I think that's really helpful. I think, in lieu of doing your own usability testing, if there's best practices on certain components, checking on Medium or other various like component or design
Sure.
system documentation sites to see like, why they're not doing something or why they are doing something is also really helpful. In terms of just like, leveraging best practices or known standards, you know, I think is a nice way to kind of shortcut the process a little bit, um, with like, with some validity, right? So not just shortcutting the process by not doing any testing or research at all. just just a different angle, right? To get some of that fitting. Because I don't necessarily think you need to do a lot of scrutiny around buttons. Like they behave the same way for the most part across all design systems because that's what people are used to. But anything unique might be worthy of people's attention, when it comes
Yeah,
to
for sure.
research. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like what needs testing and what doesn't. I think a button is like a great example. It's like, okay, like people are gonna click the button. And I suppose like there also is like this question about like what aspect of it needs usability testing, right? Like it might not be the button itself, it might be like the content that's on the button. And what you're actually testing for is like something that's going to be super useful for your content designers in terms of like how you write particular like CTAs and actions and things like that. So I think there's a lot to consider.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, sometimes it's also just helpful for design system people who are creating the design system, to see like how their products do. Because I think the other thing is
Mhm.
like kind of back to the other, like when someone submits like a really terrible component, you might be pleasantly surprised that you were wrong, that it was actually an okay comment or component, and you know you might have to backtrack and change your assumptions, and that's where usability testing and user research can help as well. We can
Maybe this
all
tells
learn.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, maybe this tells you what kind of person I am, but like, is anybody pleasantly surprised to be wrong? Like, I'm happy to add it to the design system if I'm wrong, but I'm a little bit upset if I'm wrong. But yeah, yeah, we could all be wrong, and I guess that's where usability testing gives us a little bit uh, of an opportunity to see how things might be different.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I said that for diplomatic purposes, but I know like 95% of the time design system designers aren't wrong. Um, yeah, like we kind of know what's up.
Very fair, very fair. So, yeah, I guess we're sort of getting to the end of the episode. And certainly, folks who are here with us live, feel free to ask any questions or tell us some things that have happened for you all when it comes to usability testing and user research when it comes to design systems. But I think what I'm hearing throughout the episode is that design system practitioners certainly have to be concerned with two things, right? Like, obviously we got to know who our customers are, who our stakeholders are, and those are our colleagues, folks who work on product teams, those designers, those developers who hopefully are using the design system day in and day out as part of their workflows. And it's important for us to know what they need before we build our design systems. And certainly as we build and iterate on those design systems, we need to know that it's actually solving the problems that it set out to solve. And then we want to talk to, or I suppose we don't necessarily need to do the talking, but we want to know that components, patterns, and all that jazz that we're putting out there is doing its job, and customers are able to use it. It's accessible. It's all of that. Is that kind of fair? What would you add to that in terms of how design system folks ought to think about user research?
Yeah, I think those are definitely the two main areas. I think the only thing to add, I think, is you don't have to proactively test with your customers. So
Yeah.
maybe someone is designing a feature and they're doing usability testing, and you can look at what components were in their workflow,
Hmm.
um, and then see, okay, this was tested. It might not have been directly to test the components, but you can say like, I think the idea is like you're because it should be very status quo. Like, okay, these buttons worked, right? So,
Hmm.
you're not going to have an explicit test finding around like the buttons when you see the usability report, but you could at least know that buttons were tested and they didn't create any uh, points of friction or issues with the actual flow itself. So it can be a very passive thing as well.
Yeah, for sure. Which is really good to know. I think you can sort of leave this episode and be like, "Oh my God, one more thing to add to my list of things that I have to do to have a good design system." And it's like, yeah, this is one more thing that ought to be on our minds, but it doesn't have to be something that requires a whole heap of work. And we certainly have partners who can help us out with it.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's the thing is like let's all not work more than we have to in general. But especially with design system people, like let's see where we can leverage things that exist cuz yeah, like you're right. Like let's not to add another thing to your plate. But
For
I think it's
sure.
all, anything that you do adds it's toward the greater good, right? So uh asking people early on in terms of, how they're using the design tools and code tools is helpful because that helps with adoption, right? So, uh, it's all part of the main plan.
For sure, for sure. All right. I think that might be it for today's episode that we called Where Does User Research Fit into Design Systems? I think the answer is it fits in everywhere. We hope that you join us next month. We're going to be talking about how design systems might build trust, which is a big, big question. And I think that we're going to have some fascinating answers. We're going to be joined next month with Bo from US Bank. He is the senior design system manager over there. They've been building the design system for a long time and have done some really, really cool things. So we have the opportunity to have them join us, and like always there also will be the opportunity for you to get your questions answered live. So we hope you join us then or listen to it on any of the major podcast platforms.